Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shannon Connie, and on behalf of my co-authors, I'm going to be presenting practical state recovery attacks against legacy RNG implementations. Now, I agree with you, as do my co-authors, that this is a little bit of a mouthful. So we've arranged for an alternate title and a friendly mascot to help guide our way. Don't use hard-coded keys, or duck. So we're going to see this little friend along with us throughout the journey. But first, a message from our sponsors. And without further ado, I'll give you a little context. So everyone remembers the 2013 Snowden leaks that revealed a whole lot of interesting intelligence activities. This led to suspicions about the dual EC pseudo-random number generator. In a work that my co-authors and I presented at CCS 2016, we revealed how unknown attackers repurposed the dual EC backdoor against Juniper Screenos, a leading VPN manufacturer. This led us to a few other questions. So what other RNG flaws might there be out there that lead to vulnerabilities? And further, there seemed to be a bit of a consensus among some members of the cryptographic community that as long as we eliminated certain public key designs, like dual EC, this would somewhat mitigate the risk of subverted RNG standards. So no more public key RNGs, and we're all good. However, we decided to test this hypothesis a little better by looking at existing RNG standards. So for a quick refresher on random number generators are absolutely crucial to cryptography. Pretty much every time you generate a cryptographic key or a parameter for some cryptographic protocol, you're relying on your system's pseudo-random number generator. In order for this random number generator to be secure, there are kind of two important things that are required. First, a high-quality source of entropy, and also a good pseudo-random number generator design that can be used to whiten the output from your environmental source. Our work looks at one specific pseudo-random number generator design called the ANSI X9.31 RNG. We dived into product documentation to find vulnerable implementations that use this design, and then we showed complete passive decryption against the FortiOS VPN implementation, one of the top 3 leading manufacturers of VPN devices in the United States at the time we conducted our research. So a brief recap on how government standards work. So in order to, this is Stan the standards man, and he's very hard at work inside NIST, trying to make sure that everyone's using high quality pseudo-random number generator designs. However, there are a lot of other people at the table, all of whom want to have their voice heard. There's people from the government, there are friendly developers, business people, and of course, the ever-watchful duck. Now, in order to understand this whole process, we've got to go into at least a couple of the government programs. For our purposes, the relevant programs are as follows. FIPS, the Federal Information Processing Standards, which sets a whole bunch of requirements for anyone who wants to sell their products to the government or for products that are used in the government and other highly regulated industries. And then there are 2 certification programs that allow vendors to ensure that their devices meet the requirements set out in FIPS. So the one that we're primarily going to be focusing on here is the CMVP, the Cryptographic Module Validation Program, that allows a vendor to certify that it meets the FIPS standards and that hopefully its random number generators are good. So looking at the ANSI X9.31 generator, this design has been around a really long time, almost 3 decades at this point. It was first included in an ANSI standard for financial cryptography. Then it was adopted as a FIPS standard and has been included in various standards since then. In 1998, Kelsey et al. Discovered a potential flaw in the ANSI X9.31 generator. However, despite the existence of this flaw, this random number generator continued to be included in standards over the course of quite a long period of time, the next 2 decades. Finally, in 2011, NIST deprecated the ANSI X9.31 design, and then it was sunset totally in 2016, at which point it was removed from the standards and banned from use. So what is the design of this random number generator? It functions somewhat as follows, revolving around a block cipher. In this case, we're specializing to AES because that's the one that we're going to see used in the implementation we focus on. So the random number generator takes in a timestamp t and the prior state of the pseudo-random number generator, vi-1. It performs a few iterations of AES and XORing, mixing stuff together. So it uses the block cipher and XOR as in a mixing procedure, and then it outputs an output Ri and then a new state Ri, Vi, that will be used in subsequent iterations of the pseudo-random number generator. The attack that Kelsey et al. Reported works as follows. So they noticed that if the key k is fixed, an individual who is able to determine this k and sees the output of the random number generator can reverse all the operations involved in the random number generator, brute force the timestamp, and therefore recover the state. Once the state has been recovered, the attacker can then either wind forward the pseudo-random number generator to predict future outputs by again guessing the timestamps that will be used, or they can wind it back by guessing the timestamps that had been used prior. This standard, after the reporting of the attack, appeared in one particular instance in a 2005 FIPS standard, 142 Annex C, and the precise text that was used is as follows. For AES 128-bit key, let K star be a 128-bit key. Not much there. This K star is reserved only for the generation of pseudo-random numbers. The important thing that the standard misses is any description of how this key should be generated and stored. In fact, if this is done incorrectly, it leads to the attack that Kelsey et al. Described. It also did not specify that this key should definitely not be hard-coded. So with this in mind, we hypothesized that real implementations following the standard may not have generated the key properly. The way we went about testing this hypothesis was by examining CMVP documentation. Now remember, CMVP is this certification program, and in order to be certified, vendors have to provide a whole lot of documentation in which they specify how all the different cryptographic keys are generated, used, and stored. Third-party testing labs then verify the accuracy of these claims, and so we set out to check if implementations really fit the bill. So, in order to determine this, we waded through hundreds and hundreds of pages of CMVP documentation. In order to test if an implementation was vulnerable or not, we looked for certain types of language that would indicate that the key was in fact hard-coded into every one of the devices. The same key. This is what we found. In 12 cases, we found language clearly indicating the presence of a single statically coded key. Some examples of the language that was used in the CMVP documentation is hard-coded, statically stored in the code, compiled into the binary, stored in the firmware, all of which make it fairly clear that while these implementers may have followed the standard, they did not look out for the flaw that Kelsey et al. Described. For 127 implementations, they excluded any mention of this key whatsoever, and so we were not able to determine whether it was used correctly or not. In 149 instances, the vendors provided sufficient documentation which let us ascertain that they were generating the key normally at boot time with a non-approved pseudo-random number generator. This is actually an allowed usage. You can use a system random number generator to then generate the approved key for the X9.31. And so those 149 random number generators implementations were all fine. Ducking responsibility. So manufacturers, the funny thing here is that manufacturers were not only vulnerable, but they were willing to certify that they were vulnerable to the United States government. And this is kind of curious. So to avoid ruffling too many feathers, we did engage in responsible disclosure. However, 9 out of 12 of our manufacturers didn't respond at all to our inquiries. One of the manufacturers that did respond, however, was Fortinet, and they worked productively with us. And they let us know that the ANSI X9.31 random number generator was not included in modern versions of their software, but yes, was included in prior versions from version 4 up to version 5, for which they released an end-of-life patch. So the product was already deprecated, but they were still willing to offer a patch in order to protect their customers. So we now wanted to validate that our findings. We weren't able to obtain, unfortunately, most of the devices listed in the CMVP historical records because many of them were fairly niche or they had fallen out of use. In fact, one of the vendors that we asked, Cisco, couldn't even locate the source code that had been used in their products. We were, however, able to obtain a 40OSV4 binary and a device that we could then use in order to proceed with our investigation. So what does 40OSV4 look like? Well, according to the CMVP documentation, the RNG key used for the X9.31 generator was generated external to the module. Now, this was a little suspicious, so we went to dig a little further. Reverse engineering their firmware, we found that it revolved around an old Linux kernel, roughly contemporaneous from the time of 40OSV4, and it used a custom kernel module that was loaded at boot time to replace the Linux pseudo-random number generator, devrandom and devurandom, with their own ANSI implementation. This was done so that any outputs of their pseudo-random number generator would meet the FIPS approval standard. Further, 40OSV4 used two open source packages to implement certain cryptographic protocols. OpenSSL was used for its VPN over TLS implementation and for the device administration webpage by which administrators can modify the device settings. For IPsec IKE VPNs, they used an old open source daemon called Raccoon 2. So we took a quack at reverse engineering the implementation, and this is what we found. So this is the ANSI X9.31 initialization routine that gets run at boot every time. And you can see there in red, highlighted on lines 7 to 10, the AES key hard-coded right there. With this key, we hopefully would now be able to obtain passive decryption against some of their protocols. So this is what we set out to do. However, this key was not just some random key included by them and generated externally. This was the NIST test vector key that was included in one of the standards documents. So here's a toy example of an IPsec IKE handshake, one of the protocols that we were going to target. So we've got our three normal characters that all of you are used to. There's Alice, the initiator, Bob, the responder, and Mallard in the middle, who is passively watching for traffic. So Mallard in the middle is going to watch as Bob generates a random nonce and his Diffie-Hellman parameter, and Alice sends back her nonce and Diffie-Hellman parameter. And so as we saw in the attack by Kelsey et al., we're going to need some raw outputs of the pseudo-random number generator in order to mount our attack. So the idea here is going to be to use these nonces that we're going to hope are of sufficient length in order to mount our attack, and we're also going to hope that all the RNG output blocks are in the correct order for us to be able to mount this attack. Then, once we perform the state recovery attack of Kelsey et al., we can simply wind forward the generator to produce the secret exponents used to generate the Diffie-Hellman parameters. So, quacking 40OSV4. We were able to demonstrate a full passive decryption attack against IPsec that only took about 10 seconds of computation on our workstation, or about 2 to the 25 work that we used to brute force the timestamps necessary to wind the generator forward and to recover the state. And this attack works on all unpatched 40OSV4 devices. So, how many devices are there actually on the web? We perform TLS scans and IPsec scans in order to find out. So TLS is kind of great because it provides us a lot of metadata for fingerprinting devices and ensuring that the devices we are scanning are actually 40OSV4. There are fields in the certificates, there are ETAG headers, and these we could use to fairly accurately identify devices. However, because the key generation routine used for TLS in their implementation actually gets run a second time through the OpenSSL RNG, we weren't able to use this for key recovery. Fortunately, though, the nonces that are part of a TLS handshake were just generated using the ANSI X9.31, and therefore we were able to demonstrate state recovery attacks against these devices. Kind of similarly, we scanned for IKE v2 devices. There's less metadata here. All we really had to go off was the fact that the FortiOS implementation uses 128-bit nonces, which is not unique to FortiOS, but did allow us to narrow down the field of devices. Once we'd performed that narrowing down, we tried the brute force attack against all of the devices to see how many of them out there were actually vulnerable. So these are our results. Out of the 30 million or so HTTPS hosts that responded to our queries, we found 114,000 with Fortinet certificates that said clearly in the common name that they were Fortinet, and of these, about 23,500 admitted state recovery. Of the ones that we identified using the ETAG header, we were able to crack almost all of them successfully, and this amounted to about 2.2 thousand devices. For IKE v2 hosts, about 8 million hosts responded to our handshake requests. Of these, about 50,000 had the right nonce length, but of these, against only 7 of them were we able to perform the full key recovery attack. And similarly, we matched these devices up to the TLS ones before, and were again only able to perform key recovery against 7 of them. So why do we care about this? This is, after all, like a really old random number generator. It's been around for 30 years. And this is an out-of-life device. Why should any of us pay attention to this kind of vulnerability? So there are a few reasons. The first of these is that it is well known that legacy devices still are very well widespread in use. And this is evident from the fact that we were able to discover 25,000 of these. However, there's a really big asterisk next to that, because these 25,000 devices were only those that were very poorly misconfigured and configured away from the defaults. To specify a little further, in order to identify the TLS devices, we were looking for the device administration webpage, which by default was not meant to be publicly accessible on the IPv4 address space. So an administrator would have had to have enabled this on the outgoing port. Similarly, the IPsec implementation was by default configured in point-to-point mode, which meant that it would not have responded to our requests on the public internet. So a little bit of context before we wrap up. So remember the dual EC flaw that we mentioned before? Well, the Snowden documentations made it pretty clear that were released at the time that the NSA has really extensive VPN decryption capabilities. The dual EC flaw, however, was just not widely enough implemented and was not in enough devices to explain these very broad-scale decryption capabilities. However, the ANSI X9.31 generator was very widely implemented across many different vendors and many different devices, and perhaps this can contribute a part of the explanation. Also interestingly, the ANSI X9.31 flaw is not nobody but us. Whereas the dual EC flaw could only be exploited by someone who knew a particular relationship between the parameters, this flaw is exploitable by anyone with access to a binary or source code and is able to reverse engineer out the key. So another reason why we might care about this is because this plays a part of the story of subverted RNG designs. So while there was consensus at the time of the dual EC that maybe if we eliminated public key RNGs like dual EC, we would be safe because symmetric key RNGs are harder to subvert. So one of our big findings here was really, empirically, asymmetric RNG can be subverted. And a very significant fraction of US manufactured devices had a subverted RNG for a very significant fraction of time. So our takeaways are as follows. Standardization really doesn't guarantee that there'll be an absence of flaw in the designs. Certification testing labs also should have been able to find this known flaw, but didn't. However, NIST is aware of some of these flaws in government programs and is moving towards automated testing for validation, which will hopefully help rectify some of these issues. As well, they have a number of different designs out there, which are hopefully more secure. And finally, our last message, a reminder, don't use hard-coded keys. Thank you.
All right, questions?
Yeah, so
Do we have audio on the microphone over there?
Can you hear me? Or?
Yes.
Can you hear? Okay, good. So beyond not using hard-coded keys, so do you have a sense for those implementations that actually do things correctly, or if they were not vulnerable, how well protected the key actually is, right? Because generally we want to protect against state compromise. That's the stronger model. So ideally, I don't want to have a key at all. And it's easy to fix the construction not to have a key.
So the best thing you could do is move away from that design.
Right.
But the ones that, as far as we knew, didn't suffer from a serious flaw, used the same design, but were dynamically generating the key. So the key would actually be rotated over time, and so just because you were able to reverse engineer the firmware would not guarantee you state recovery because you'd have to know some boot time information.
Okay. But say, I don't know, I have a virtual machine which has a particular state, and I get access to the state of the RNG. So is the key well protected, or is it just there to be?
So in that case, the key would not be suitably protected.
Okay.
That's why this design has been deprecated now, because it has this known flaw and doesn't really recover from compromise.
Thank you.
Ducking good talk. So on your results slide, why was there such a big gap in like lines 2 and 3 above and below the line? Like from 114,000, you can only recover 23,000 or 7.
So at least, firstly, with the HTTPS devices, we weren't able to identify which version of the software we were running. And as we were running this attack when 40OS v5 had already been released, it's reasonable to assume that a large number of the devices out there would actually be running a non-vulnerable version of the software. With Ike v2, it's a little trickier to say, but probably because most of the 128-bit nonce devices were not actually FortiGate at all. Plenty of different implementations use 128-bit nonces, and so the 7 that we identified just would have been the FortiGate ones running the builds of the software that were vulnerable.
Great, thanks.
So I have a last question. So it seems that in terms of design, right, you're relying on a random number to be generated to get a key. So can you comment on that design decision? It seems that there's something wrong here in this fundamental building block design.
Yeah, so
it seems like you have a sort of a duck and egg problem here.
So there are a couple of modern designs that are used now. The ones that are still present in the latest version of the standards document, which originally included dual EC, includes a couple of other constructions, one of which uses something similar that just rotates the key very frequently. And then there are 2 other designs which don't revolve around block ciphers, and so suffer if the design considerations are fairly different. So there's one that revolves around HMAC, and the other one is escaping me right now. Yeah, and HashDRBG is the other one.
All right. Thank you very much.